In the autumn of 1902, on a cold concrete pad at the Royal Navy's gunnery school, a British officer fired a pistol once and refused to fire it again. So did the next officer, and the next. Every man who pulled the trigger of this weapon put it down and walked away. It was the most powerful handgun on earth, and it destroyed the man who built it. This is his story. Whale Island, Portsmouth, the autumn of 1902. The cold came off the harbor in slow gray sheets, wrapping the dockyard in the kind of damp that soaked through a wool tunic before a man realized he was shivering. Gulls turned in the wind above the gunnery school, calling to nothing. Below them, on a bare stretch of concrete used for pistol trials, a naval officer stood at the firing line with a weapon that did not look like any pistol he had ever held. It was too long. It was too heavy. The barrel measured nearly 10 inches from muzzle to receiver. Yep. The grip was thick, wrapped around a magazine loaded from below, and the cartridges inside sat backwards, their noses pointing toward the shooter's own chest. 3 pounds of steel and walnut, cold in his hands, waiting. He raised the pistol. He aligned the sights on a wooden target 25 yards away. He drew a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. He held the trigger back. The mechanism did not fire. He felt his shoulders tense. He glanced at the officer beside him, who said nothing. Then, slowly, uncertainly, he released his finger. The pistol fired. The entire top of the weapon slammed rearward across the back of his hand. 3 full inches of travel, the bolt sweeping over his wrist like a small piston driven backward by a hammer. A spent brass case, the size of a man's thumb, whipped past his cheek and flew straight to the rear over his own forearm. The muzzle flash bloomed 3 feet long in the cold dockyard air, a pale orange bloom against the gray sky. The report cracked off the brick warehouses across the yard and came back twice. When the bolt finally returned and locked, the officer was staring at a pistol that had just done something no other handgun on earth in 1902 could do. It had fired a .45 caliber bullet at 1,250 feet per second. That same year, in a test, the British Army ran on stacked half-inch wooden planks. This pistol punched through 16 of them. The Mauser C-96, the German semi-automatic that the Army had tested only months before, drove through 11. The .38 Colt revolver managed 6. The officer lowered the weapon. He looked at his hand. He looked at the pistol. And then, according to the report he later filed, he did what almost every man who fired the Mars automatic pistol in those trials did. He handed it back. The captain in charge of those naval tests preserved the moment in a single sentence, a sentence that survived for over a century, quoted in Geoffrey Boothroyd's book, The Handgun, in 1970. No one who fired once with the pistol wished to shoot it again. That sentence is the entire story. And the man who designed the weapon, the man who spent every shilling he had and every friendship he owned trying to make the world want it, believed until the day he went bankrupt that he had built the future of the fighting handgun. He had. The future just didn't want it. His name was Hugh William Gabbett-Fairfax. He was 53 years old in the autumn of 1902. Anglo-Irish by birth, a civil engineer by training, born in March of 1849 in Trichinopoly in the Madras Presidency of British India. He was educated at Trinity College, Dublin, one of the oldest universities in the English-speaking world, where he studied engineering with the discipline of a man who believed that any problem, given enough steel and enough thought, could be solved. By 1897, he was living in London at 107 Lambeth Palace Road, a narrow address in the shadow of the Archbishop's residence on the south bank of the Thames. From that address, he began sending patent applications to Washington and to the British Patent Office. He was not a soldier. He had never served in a war. He had never, as far as any surviving record shows, fired a shot in anger. But he had looked at the world's fighting pistols, and he had decided that every one of them was wrong. To understand what he saw, you have to understand the state of the military handgun in the 1890s. There were two kinds of pistol a soldier could carry. The first was the revolver. The British Webley was the finest of them, a heavy top brake design that swung open on a hinge and reloaded 6 cartridges at a time. It was slow. A trained man could empty and reload it in perhaps 15 seconds. But it was reliable. It fired every time the trigger was pulled. It used medium-powered cartridges, the 455 Webley among them, cartridges chosen for a balance of stopping power and controllability. A man hit in the chest at close range by a 455 Webley bullet generally went down. A man hit in the arm generally did not. The second was the automatic. This was the new thing. The German engineer Hugo Borchardt had produced one of the earliest practical designs in 1893. Paul Mauser had followed in 1896 with the C-96, the pistol that would soon appear in the holsters of officers on every continent. These weapons fired small, fast, bottleneck cartridges, the 7.63 Mauser being the most famous. The bullets moved at over 1,400 feet per second. They punched clean, narrow holes. They cycled the action automatically, feeding fresh rounds from a magazine, offering rates of fire the revolver could not match. But those small, fast bullets did not reliably stop a determined man. Reports were already circulating from colonial actions in Africa and Asia of soldiers hit 2, 3, 4 times with 7.63 Mauser rounds, who continued to fight, who continued to advance, who had to be shot again with a rifle to be brought down. Gabbett-Fairfax looked at both of these weapons, and he decided that both of them were wrong. He believed a fighting pistol should hit with the energy of a small rifle. He believed a self-loading action could be built strong enough to contain the pressures required. He believed that a soldier at close range, in the confusion of a colonial skirmish or a boarding action, deserved a weapon that would put a man down with a single shot at any sensible distance. He set out to build it himself, and from the very first prototype, every choice he made was the harder choice. An easier man, an easier engineer, would have taken an existing action, a Mauser or a Borchardt, and simply chambered it for a stronger cartridge. Gabbett-Fairfax did the opposite. He decided that no existing action could safely contain the pressures he wanted. So he invented an entirely new one. The patent was filed in March of 1898. The mechanism he described in that patent has been used by only one other production pistol in the entire history of firearms. It was called Long-Recoil, and it worked like this. When the shooter pulled the trigger, the barrel and bolt did not stay locked in place, as they did in a Colt or a Mauser or later a Luger. They did not separate after a fraction of an inch of travel. Instead, the entire upper assembly, barrel and bolt locked together by a rotating bolt head, recoiled backwards for 3 to 4 full inches, backwards across the shooter's hand, backwards past his wrist. At the rearmost position, the bolt rotated and unlocked from the barrel. Then the barrel, freed from the bolt, snaked forward on its own return spring. As it moved forward, the spent cartridge case was stripped from the chamber and flung out the back of the action, thrown to the rear over the firer's wrist. Then a cartridge elevator dragged the next round backwards out of the magazine. Because the rounds sat nose forward in the grip, they had to be pulled rearward before they could be lifted and chambered. The bolt stayed locked open. It would not move, not until the shooter released the trigger. Only then did the bolt slam home. Only then did the fresh round enter the chamber. Only then was the pistol ready to fire again. Read that sequence again. The Mars fired when the shooter let go. This was not a mistake. It was not an accident of design. Gabbett-Fairfax believed the pause, that unnatural interval between squeezing and releasing, gave the cartridge elevator time to position the next round with absolute precision. He believed it eliminated the feeding failures that plagued every early automatic pistol he had studied, and in a narrow, mechanical sense, he was right. The mechanism, when it worked, but it demanded a trigger pull of 10 pounds, more than double what any pistol shooter of the period was trained to expect. It created a recoil sequence, 3 inches of bolt travel over the wrist that no shooter had ever felt before. And it required a habit of behavior, squeeze, hold, release to fire, that no soldier under fire would ever instinctively learn. The first 12 pistols were built by Webley and Scott of Birmingham, one of the oldest firearms manufacturers in Britain, under the supervision of a young engineer named William Whiting. Whiting was a rising talent inside Webley. He had a career ahead of him. He would, in the years that followed the Mars project, design Webley's own successful service automatic pistols, weapons that would be carried by British officers into the Great War. But in 1898 and 1899 and into 1900, William Whiting stood at a workbench in Birmingham and tried to make Hugh Gabbett-Fairfax's design work. The collaboration did not survive. By 1900, Webley and Scott had had enough. The firm wanted to simplify the design. They wanted to reduce the number of hand-fitted parts. They wanted to bring costs down and reliability up. They wanted, in the language of every industrial partnership that has ever collapsed, a commercial product. Gabbett-Fairfax refused. He would not compromise. He would not soften the trigger. He would not tame the recoil. He would not pistol. He would not accept that a pistol, which fired 16 planks worth of energy per round, might be, in some fundamental way, more than any human shooter could actually use. Webley walked away, and Gabbett-Fairfax, alone now, moved his operation to a small workshop near the Birmingham Proof House, the ancient testing facility where every firearm made in the city was pressure tested before it could be sold. There, by himself, with a handful of assistants and no institutional backing, he built the next 56 pistols by hand. No two of them were dimensionally identical. Parts from one Mars pistol will not fit another Mars pistol. Even weapons with consecutive serial numbers. The frames varied. The bolt dimensions varied. The magazines varied. Every pistol was, in effect, its own prototype, its own experiment, its own singular object. He financed every penny of it with personal loans. By the end of 1903, he was bankrupt. But before the collapse came the trials. Before the collapse came the reports. Before the collapse came the moment when the British military, the largest and most powerful military purchasing authority on earth, held Hugh Gabbett-Fairfax's dream in its hands and decided what to do with it. That is where the story truly begins. Because the Mars pistol was not rejected for being weak. It was not rejected for being unreliable. It was not rejected for being inaccurate. It was rejected for a reason no engineer of his era had ever heard before. And the man who built it, standing at 53 years old in a Birmingham workshop, watching his life's savings drain into a project that would never sell, could not understand why. Birmingham. The winter of 1900. The workshop stood in a narrow lane near the proof house, where the coal smoke from 10,000 chimneys settled over the roofs in a permanent gray haze. Inside, gas lamps hissed against the damp. The air smelled of oil and hot brass and the sharp tang of freshly cut steel. Hugh Gabbett-Fairfax was 51 years old that winter. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His hands, once soft from the drafting table, now carried the small scars and calluses of a man who had begun to do his own metalwork because he could no longer afford to pay others. Webley and Scott had walked out 6 months earlier. The break had been quiet. No public quarrel. No angry letters in the trade press. Just a decision, taken in a paneled office on Weeman Street, that the Mars project had consumed enough of the firm's time and enough of William Whiting's talent, and that the future lay elsewhere. Whiting had gone back to his own drawings. Gabbett-Fairfax had gone back to his workshop alone. He hired a shop manager, a man named Clement Brown, who would stay with him to the end. He took out more loans against his patents. He began to build the next batch of pistols by hand, one at a time, each one slightly different from the last, each one a slightly better guess at what the mechanism truly wanted to be. Between 1901 and 1903, roughly 8 separate trials and demonstrations were held for the Mars pistol before the British Army and the Royal Navy. The venues had the weight of empire behind them. The School of Musketry at Hythe on the Kentish coast, where every British infantry doctrine of the era was tested and codified. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, where technical inspectors measured tolerances to the thousandth of an inch. The Naval Gunnery School at HMS Excellent on Whale Island in Portsmouth, where the Royal Navy trained its gunnery officers within sight of the fleet at anchor. Gabbett-Fairfax appeared at each of them. A tall man in a dark coat carrying a leather case that held 2 or 3 pistols and a small supply of hand-loaded ammunition. He would set out his weapons on a plain wooden table. He would answer questions in the clipped, precise voice of an engineer who had rehearsed every possible objection 1,000 times in his own head. And then he would step back and let the officers fire the guns. On the 28th of October, 1902, at Hythe, the testing went catastrophically wrong. The pistol under trial that day was a .45 caliber Mars Long. The testers were Army officers, men who had fired thousands of rounds through Webley revolvers and considered themselves correctly among the best pistol shots in the empire. They loaded the magazine. They fired. They reloaded. They fired again. At round 410, the left bolt retraction ear snapped clean off. The bolt retraction ears were small tabs of steel that projected from the sides of the bolt. The shooter used them, gripping between thumb and finger, to pull the bolt backward for the first round of a magazine. Losing one ear made the pistol harder to charge. It did not make the pistol unfireable. The testers continued. At round 817, the right ear broke as well. Now the bolt could not be pulled back at all. The pistol was jammed shut, useless, a 3-pound paperweight of Birmingham steel. 817 rounds was, in the context of 1902, an extraordinary number of shots for a service pistol to sustain without a parts breakage. Most contemporary automatics failed at a fraction of that count. But the manner of the failure, two symmetrical pieces of the same component, on the same weapon, under the same class of load, was exactly the kind of pattern a small arms committee noticed. Symmetrical failure meant systemic weakness. It meant the design itself was working the metal past what the metal could bear. The testing officer wrote it down. Then he wrote down the penetration figures. Against a stack of half-inch wooden planks, the Mars drove a bullet through 16. The 7.63 Mauser drove through 11. The .38 Colt revolver drove through 6. The Mars was, by any measurable standard, the most powerful handgun the British military had ever evaluated. And the final report of the War Office Small Arms Committee, recorded years later in Edward E. Zell's Handguns of the World, read like a polite execution. A very powerful pistol. Its accuracy, penetration, and no doubt its stopping power are good. It is, however, complicated in its present form, would be difficult to clean, and is heavy. A great deal of firing has been carried out with it. The mechanism did not always work well, and the recoil was complained of. The Director General of Ordnance went further. He praised the long-barreled, shoulder-stocked version of the Mars as, in his own words, a very small and compact rifle, accurate to 300 yards offhand and 600 yards from the shoulder. Then he added the sentence that killed the project. The Army, he wrote, would only consider troop trials if the muzzle velocity were reduced to not more than 1,150 feet per second. Read what that means. The Mars was rejected, in part, for being too powerful. The Army that wanted a powerful pistol had found a weapon that outran what its own men could tolerate. The 10-pound trigger pull was double what shooters were trained to expect. The rearward case ejection threw hot brass into the firer's face and over his shoulder. The bolt, sweeping 3 inches back over the wrist with every shot, made one-handed shooting unpleasant and two-handed shooting, a technique that barely existed as doctrine in 1902, almost impossible. The recoil itself, a 48-ounce pistol firing a 220-grain bullet at over 1,250 feet per second, generated a muzzle rise and a felt impulse that no service pistol of the era came close to producing. The contemporary writer H.B.C. Pollard captured it in a sentence that outlived every other description of the gun. He allowed his ideals to wander in the direction of high ballistics, and his pistols accordingly took on the form of young cannons. Young cannons. Gabbett-Fairfax wrote almost nothing for the public record in those years. He gave no interviews. He published no books. Whatever grief he felt at Hythe, whatever fury he felt at Enfield, whatever quiet devastation he carried home to his workshop after each rejection, he kept to himself. Only one first-person fragment of his voice survives. It comes from a letter he wrote to the trade magazine Arms and Explosives in 1899. In 1899, 3 years before the Whale Island trial, at a point when he still believed the world would come around. In that letter, describing his main commercial rival, the Revolver, he used a single word. He called it excellent. A man on the edge of ruin. A man who had staked his fortune and his name on proving the Revolver obsolete. A man who would be bankrupt within 4 years. And he called his competitor's product excellent. It is the only personal note we have from him. And it tells you almost everything about the kind of man he was. He was honest. He was precise. He was incapable of the small commercial dishonesties that might have saved him. By the end of 1903, the loans came due. The suppliers wanted their invoices paid. The landlord wanted his rent. The Birmingham tradesmen who had extended credit on the strength of Gabbett-Fairfax's reputation wanted their money. There was no money. Approximately 68 pistols had been built under his direct supervision. 12 at Webley and Scott, and 56 more by his own hand in the Birmingham workshop. The personal debts he had taken on to build them had grown beyond anything he could ever repay. The bankruptcy proceedings began that winter. The workshop near the proof house was cleared. The tools were auctioned. The unfinished pistols on the workbench, some half-assembled, some still in the white, were seized by the creditors. And Hugh Gabbett-Fairfax, at 54 years old, walked out of the building that had held his life's work with nothing in his hands but the patents themselves. The patents were the only thing left, and the creditors, watching him leave, had already begun to wonder whether those patents in the right hands might yet be worth something. They were about to try Birmingham, the spring of 1904. The workshop near the proof house had a new sign on the door. Mars Automatic Pistol Syndicate, Limited. The creditors had done what desperate creditors do. They had gathered in a Birmingham solicitor's office, added up what they were owed, and decided that the only way to recover anything was to keep the project alive. They pooled the debts. They incorporated a company. They took possession of the patents that Hugh Gabbett-Fairfax had signed over in the final settlement of his bankruptcy. And then they hired the one man who still knew how the pistols were built. Clement Brown, the former shop manager, walked back through the door he had walked out of a few months earlier. Same workbench, same tools, repurchased at auction. Same half-finished pistols waiting on the racks. Gabbett-Fairfax was not there. He had gone quietly. Where he lived in those years, how he paid for his lodgings, whether he still corresponded with the men who had once believed in him, the record does not say. He filed no new patents in 1904. He filed none in 1905. The workshop that carried his name was no longer his. Clement Brown filed a patent in December of 1905. It was assigned to the Syndicate. It described improvements to to the breech mechanism, small refinements meant to reduce the parts breakage that had ended the Hythe trial 3 years before. Brown was not trying to redesign the Mars. He was trying to save it, one modification at a time, in the hope that a modified pistol might find the buyers the original had not. The Syndicate produced perhaps 20 more pistols. They marketed an improved Mars in 1906. They approached the same military purchasing authorities that had already said no. They sent samples to the same trade press that had already published HBC. Pollard's line about young cannons. No orders came. By 1907, the Mars Automatic Pistol Syndicate was dissolved. Total production across every workshop and every company and every hand-fitted variant, from the first Webley prototype in 1898 to the last Syndicate pistol in 1907, was approximately 80 weapons, 80 pistols, for 9 years of work. For every shilling Hugh Gabbett-Fairfax had ever earned, for the ruin of one engineer and the quiet dissolution of a small Birmingham company. 80 pistols. And then the world moved on to a larger war. In August of 1914, the British Army entered the Great War carrying the Webley Mark VI revolver, the same class of weapon Gabbett-Fairfax had spent his life trying to render obsolete. The Mars pistol, wherever the surviving examples had ended up, was already a curiosity, a collector's piece, a footnote in the trade catalogs of Birmingham gunsmiths. 3 years later, on a battlefield of the Great War, at the age of 23, Thomas Gabbett-Fairfax was killed in action. He was Hugh's son, a young British Army officer. The records of the Great War preserve the fact of his death and the year 1917, but they do not preserve what his father was told, or how the telegram reached him, or where he was sitting when he read it. An engineer who had built the most powerful handgun in the world, watching his son go to a war, fought with weapons other men had designed and not come home. Hugh Gabbett-Fairfax lived 3 more years after that. He continued to file firearms patents. None of them were ever taken up by any manufacturer. He continued to correspond, in his precise engineer's handwriting, with the small circle of gunsmiths and inventors who still remembered his name. He did not become bitter as far as anyone recorded. He did not write memoirs. He did not defend his work. He simply kept working. On November the 6th, 1920, Hugh William Gabbett-Fairfax died. He was 71 years old. He was buried in Melcombe Regis Cemetery in Weymouth on the Dorset coast, in a plot whose stone still stands today, weathered by a century of sea wind. 80 pistols, 1 son, 71 years, and then the long silence began. The surviving Mars pistols scattered. Some went to Britain's Royal Armories. Some crossed the Channel and ended up in German collections. Some passed through the hands of private buyers who understood or half understood what they were holding. Two of them found their way to the Royal Armories at Leeds, where they sit today under glass, catalogued, preserved, occasionally brought out for inspection. In October of 2025, more than a century after Gabbett-Fairfax's death, Jonathan Ferguson, the keeper of firearms and artillery at the Royal Armories, was filmed handling both surviving Leeds examples together for a brief museum video. It is the only known footage of two Mars pistols being examined side by the institution that holds them. At least two more Mars pistols reside at the German Military Museum at Koblenz on the Rhine, held there by a German curatorial tradition that has always understood the value of engineering that failed on its own terms. The rest, perhaps 70 weapons in total, are scattered across private collections in Britain and the United States and continental Europe. They surface from time to time at auction. In May of 2025, at Rock Island Auction Company in Bedford, Texas, a Mars pistol in 5mm, serial number 43, in its original wooden case with cleaning rod and an H. Clark and Sons oil tin, sold for approximately $60,000, including the buyer's premium. The same pistol, when new in 1902, cost Hugh Gabbett-Fairfax more than he ever earned back from it. The same pistol, when new in 1902, ruined the man who built it. And here is the final measurement, the one that Gabbett-Fairfax did not live to see. The .45 Mars long cartridge pushed a 220-grain bullet at 1,250 feet per second, producing approximately 763 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. For comparison, the Colt .45 automatic that arrived 9 years later, in 1911, produced about 350 foot-pounds. The German Luger, about 355. The British service Webley revolver that Gabbett-Fairfax had once called excellent, about 220. 70 years passed before another self-loading pistol matched what the Mars had done in 1902. Not the Luger, not the Colt 1911, not the Browning High Power, not any service pistol carried through 2 world wars. It was not until the Automag, an American design that entered production in the early 1970s, that another automatic pistol reached the energy class Hugh Gabbett-Fairfax had reached from a Birmingham workshop in 1898. He had been right. That is the part of the story that gets lost in the reports and the auction catalogs and the museum labels. He had been right about the physics. He had been right about the ballistics. He had been right that a self-loading action could contain a rifle-class cartridge and deliver it from a handgun. He had simply been wrong about the men, wrong about what a soldier's hand could tolerate, wrong about what a peacetime army was willing to buy, wrong about the year, the decade, the century in which the world would be ready for what he had built. Go back one last time to Whale Island in the autumn of 1902 A naval officer puts down a pistol and writes his report. The captain in charge signs off on the sentence that has survived for over 120 years. No one who fired once with the pistol wished to shoot it again. The captain meant it as an execution. He meant that no army, no navy, no serious military purchasing authority could adopt a service weapon that grown, trained men refused to fire twice. He was correct, but the sentence itself, preserved in a Royal Navy filing cabinet, copied into Geoffrey Boothroyd's book in 1970, is also, from a different angle, the only proof the world ever needed that Hugh Gabbett-Fairfax had succeeded. He had built a handgun that hit harder than anyone believed a handgun could hit. 70 years would pass before another pistol matched it. The young cannons, in the end, were exactly what he had meant them to be. The world simply did not have anyone in his lifetime willing to fire them twice.